During the 1960s, the Soviet Union was pursuing a military space station project. In October of 1964, the project was announced by the OKB-52 Design Bureau and was given the code name Almaz, which is Russian for diamond, a crewed spacecraft equipped with cameras and electromagnetic sensors. It was a response to the U.S. Manned Orbiting Laboratory program, which was started in December of 1963 and officially announced in August of 1965. Soviet military officials saw crewed reconnaissance spacecraft as more effective than automated satellites, as did their American counterparts. Optimistic reports in the U.S. press about the planned capabilities of MOL drove the push by the Soviet designers for the Almaz project. In October of the following year, the Soviet Ministry of General Machine Building approved the Almaz program. The Chief Intelligence Directorate, known by the Russian abbreviation GRU, was the intelligence branch of the Soviet military and would be the main user. It was to consist of the Orbital Piloted Station Module, or OPS, which would be the station's core module. Along with that would be the FGB, a separate spacecraft intended to serve as a resupply craft for the Almaz stations. It was to provide electrical power, propulsion, guidance, and docking. It was to have a large cargo bay and external fuel tanks. Also included was the VA spacecraft, which would be the launch and return craft for the crews and was planned to be reusable for up to 10 flights. The OPS was to be 13.6 feet in diameter with a mass of 20 tons and an internal volume of 1,680 cubic feet. The initial space station design would entail the launch of an Almaz OPS with the VA return craft with a 3-person crew aboard, launched on a Proton rocket. Upon reaching orbit, the crew would enter the station module through a hatch in the heat shield of the base of the VA capsule. Following a 30 to 60-day mission consisting of military reconnaissance, the crew would return to Earth aboard the VA vehicle. OKB-52 engineers also designed the Transport and Supply Ship, or TKS, which would also be launched in a Proton rocket. This would deliver cargo to the station, along with a crew of 3 in a VA capsule. A major difference between MOL and Almaz was that Almaz was designed to be recrewed and resupplied using the TKS resupply craft, consisting of an FGB and a VA return craft carrying the crew, launched on a Proton rocket. The TKS would dock at the docking port left vacant after the previous crew had departed the station in their VA capsule. The stations would be designed for a 2-year useful life. Throughout the 1960s, the program was given a low priority, as the Soviet space program's primary focus was the moon race with the United States. The development of the Almaz spacecraft itself would end up proceeding faster than the human rating of the VA capsule and the Proton rocket, so instead, the initial phase of the program would involve the launch of 3 Almaz stations without the VA capsule, and a 2-person crew would travel separately aboard a modified Salyut spacecraft. The plan was for the stations to each be visited by 3 missions, each lasting 2 months. The second phase was to have ongoing operations carried out with stations comprised of 2 Almaz modules resupplied by TKS crewed resupply craft. The first flight was planned for 1968. Infighting among the designers and engineers led to delays, as well as delays in the development of critical systems, and the first flight would now not be until 1969. Later development delays meant that the first flight wouldn't be until 1970. By 1969, several Almaz station hulls were built. However, the necessary hardware to complete them had not been delivered. In June of 1969, the Manned Orbiting Laboratory was canceled, taking away the original justification for Almaz. A proposal was presented to modify an Almaz hull into a DOS civilian space station, despite DOS being the project of a rival faction of engineers. Incomplete Almaz modules would be repurposed and outfitted as civilian Salyut space stations with the intent to beat the U.S. Skylab space station project. Both DOS and Almaz were later named Salyut, hiding the fact that each had been the work of different designers. Also in July of 1969, the first lunar landing had been achieved by American astronauts, beating the Soviets to the moon. The moon race was over, and the Soviet space program redirected its efforts towards space stations. Almaz was allowed to proceed. Ultimately, the original plan of launching Almaz and the TKS together was never realized, and no TKS served as a resupply craft. The Almaz design would become the OPS core modules of the Salyut program. Ground tests of the station's maneuvering engines were carried out between 1969 and 1971. At the beginning of 1970, 8 prototypes and 2 flight-worthy versions of the station had been built, and 22 cosmonauts were in training for the Almaz missions. Almaz was being developed in parallel with the civilian space station project known as DOS-7K, although it was given a lower priority than DOS-7K. In February of 1971, both programs were allowed to proceed separately. Testing of Almaz systems was conducted in parallel with the work being done on the DOS project. The first DOS station was transported to the Baikonur Cosmodrome in what is today the nation of Kazakhstan. Work on the station was completed there and was launched on April 19, 1971, making it the world's first space station, Salyut 1. A crew of 3 cosmonauts was launched aboard Soyuz 11 to the station on June the 6th and arrived at the station the following day. Tragically, the crew of 3 were killed during the return to Earth 21 days later when the Soyuz spacecraft depressurized. As a result, crews for both stations were reduced to 2. The Salyut 1 crew had not been wearing pressure suits, and the bulk of such suits took up enough space in the Soyuz spacecraft that there would only be room for 2 cosmonauts. Crews for the initial phase of the Almaz program were formed in the second half of 1972. Most Soviet cosmonaut crews were comprised of a military pilot commanding the mission, with a civilian specialist serving as the flight engineer. Instead, Almaz crews would be all military. A launch attempt of the second DOS station in July of 1972 resulted in the failure of the Proton rocket. Almaz was selected for the second station launch. The station was transported to Baikonur in January of 1973. The first 10-day mission was planned for that March. Delays still plagued the project, and launch attempts in March were scrubbed because the Soyuz spacecraft was not ready. The station was ultimately launched on April 3rd and successfully reached orbit. However, on April 15th, ground controllers discovered that the internal pressure had dropped by half. It was later determined that the Proton third stage was on a similar orbital path to the station and had exploded 3 days after launch. A cloud of debris struck the station 10 days later, resulting in the hull being breached and the station depressurizing, as well as both solar panels being torn loose, resulting in the loss of electrical power and altitude control. The station was never crewed, and it re-entered the atmosphere in May of 1973. To hide that there were 2 Soviet space station projects, as well as to hide the station's military mission, it was publicly announced as Salyut 2. Despite the efforts of Soviet officials to cover up the failure of the station and its military purpose, Western observers were able to determine that the mission was a failure, as well as its military mission. This was due to the station using the same radio frequencies that were used by Soviet reconnaissance satellites. The stations were known in the West as military Salyuts. The second Almaz, OPS-2, or Salyut 3, was launched on June 25, 1974 on a Proton rocket. The station consisted of an airlock, a work compartment, and a living compartment. The total volume was 3,200 cubic feet. It was equipped with 2 solar panels, 1 docking port, and 2 engines. The work compartment contained an Earth observation telescope with a focal length of 21 feet and a resolution of 9 feet. The telescope was used with a large film camera and was used for military reconnaissance. The reconnaissance systems were referred to in the Soviet press as remote sensing equipment. Cosmonauts could develop film aboard the station, printing and scanning images with the TV imaging system to be transmitted to Earth. It only took 30 minutes to shoot, develop, and scan a photo. Other images were loaded into a small Earth return capsule and ejected from the station. The use of military radio frequencies and the relatively low altitude of the station made Western observers suspect the military purpose of the station. Soyuz 14 was launched a week after the station was launched, on July 4th, and it successfully docked, and spent 15 days at the station. Exposed film was returned to Earth in a return capsule. The crew returned to Earth on July 19th. It was the first time a crewed reconnaissance spacecraft was operated in space. The second mission to the station, Salyut 15, launched on August 26, 1974, and arrived on the 28th. The automated rendezvous system of the Soyuz failed, and so much fuel had been used in the attempt to close in and dock with the station manually that the mission was ended and it returned to Earth that day. This Almaz had a 23mm cannon on the forward underside of the station. The cannon was a modified version of the tail gun of the Tupolev Tu-22 bomber, able to fire 2,000 rounds per minute. It was on a fixed mounting and required that the entire station be maneuvered to aim it. Due to the possibility of excessive vibration, no test firings to the crew aboard were carried out. The gun was tested by remote ground control following the last crewed mission to the station. It was the only known armed, crewed military spacecraft to have flown. The next planned mission to the station was cancelled, and on September 23rd, the station was commanded by ground control to release a capsule containing experiments to return to Earth. It was actually carrying exposed film. The capsule was damaged during re-entry, but the film was recovered intact. Despite Soyuz 14 being the only one of the 3 crews that were planned to visit the station, they did conduct the first completely successful Soviet space station mission. The station was deorbited on January 24, 1975, over the Pacific Ocean. The Soviet press stated that Salyut 3 had been the first station to continuously keep the same orientation in relation to the Earth's surface. This required 500,000 firings of the attitude control thrusters. This indicated to Western observers that the station had conducted reconnaissance. No further missions to the station were flown due to the time needed to upgrade the Soyuz rendezvous system. The third and final Almaz space station was also known as OPS-3. It was launched on June 22, 1976 on a Proton rocket. Its design was the same as the previous Almaz stations and carried a radio system that enabled data to be sent to the ground in real time. The first mission to the station, Soyuz 21, was launched on July 6th. The automatic rendezvous system malfunctioned, but the crew was able to perform a manual docking. It was initially planned to be a 2-month mission. However, toxic fumes began leaking into the crew module and caused the mission to end early, returning to Earth on August 24th. The second mission to the station, Soyuz 23, launched on October 14, 1976. A malfunction of the automated docking system led to too much fuel being used and was unable to dock under manual control and returned to Earth on October 16th. The third and final mission, Soyuz 24, was launched on February 7, 1977. The crew successfully docked with the station and carried out repairs to deal with the contamination. Solar observations were among the scientific experiments carried out. The crew returned to Earth on February 25th. The mission was cut short due to low fuel for the station's attitude control system. The following day, a film capsule was ejected by ground control. A fourth mission was being prepared to fly to the station. However, there were delays in readying additional Soyuz spacecraft, extending past the time when the fuel supply aboard the station would run out, and this flight was thus cancelled. The station was ultimately deorbited on August 8, 1977. Despite the problems encountered, Phase 1 of Almaz was considered a success, with the crews successfully operating the reconnaissance equipment aboard the stations. Despite this, however, the military had realized that crewed reconnaissance was too expensive and that uncrewed satellites were better suited, as had their American counterparts realized almost a decade earlier when the Manned Orbiting Laboratory was canceled. Uncrewed test flights with Almaz hardware were carried out from the end of 1976 through 1979. A fourth Almaz station module, OPS-4, was completed but never flown. It was to be equipped with a synthetic aperture radar and a crewed return vehicle. It was also to be equipped with an improved autocannon for defense. It also had a docking adapter for the TKS transport spacecraft. However, delays in crew rating the TKS required that the station also have a second docking port in the forward section for Soyuz dockings. Program directors still plan to send an uncrewed TKS to the station to carry supplies, perhaps in advance of the Soyuz crew's arrival. The TKS will provide extra life support, power supply, and propulsion to the station. Optical reconnaissance equipment would be replaced with radar and electronic surveillance equipment. From early 1978, funding was reduced, putting OPS-4 behind schedule as competing space station projects were given as a justification for the budget cuts, and OPS-4 was not flown. In June of 1978, the Almaz crewed station project was officially canceled. Along with the 3 flown stations, OPS-1 to OPS-3, 7 additional Almaz space station space frames had been built when the program was canceled. OPS-4, Almaz-205, Almaz-206, Almaz-T, and Almaz-T2. Phase 2 flights were planned for 1981 to 1982, with uncrewed flights testing the TKS and the VA return capsule, and connecting 2 Almaz modules were also to be carried out. Phase 2 was canceled in 1979. 3 finished TKS modules were flown uncrewed to Salyut space stations in 1981 through 1985. Almaz was repurposed as a large radar-equipped reconnaissance satellite. 3 completed Almaz hulls would be converted into uncrewed Almaz-T satellites. Technical issues and infighting among military officials delayed the project for several years, and the hardware was stored until the mid-1980s. The Phase 2 Almaz stations were repurposed as automated crew-tended Almaz-T reconnaissance satellites. They were intended to be launched and visited by Soyuz crews during the 1980s. Although it was planned for launch in 1980, it was delayed until 1986, and by then it was decided that it be a fully automated satellite with no crew flights. Almaz-T was finally approved in April of 1986. The first Almaz-T was launched on October 29, 1986. However, it failed to reach orbit after the Proton rocket's first and second stages failed to separate. The second Almaz-T was successfully launched on July 25, 1987, and operated for 2 years, producing radar images with a resolution of 75 feet. It was deorbited on July 30, 1989. The third Almaz-T, named Almaz-1, was launched successfully on March 31, 1991. However, upon reaching orbit, it was determined by ground control that one of the communications antennas had failed, and that one of the solar panels had failed to deploy. Despite this, the satellite was able to function and provide data. It was deorbited 18 months later on October 17, 1992, over the Pacific Ocean. The fall of the Soviet Union in December of 1991 put an end to further Almaz-T satellites. The final variant was Almaz-1V, a civilian Earth resources satellite, which was approved in 1986, but the Soviet Union fell before it was constructed. Efforts to promote commercial versions of the Almaz and TKS variants were unsuccessful. Almaz and TKS variants were later used as the basis for the Zvezda and Zarya modules of the International Space Station. Years later, in 2005, the British company Excalibur Almaz was founded in 2005 with the intention of using the unflown Almaz modules as a commercial space station to be a tourist destination in space. The company purchased the 2 partially completed Almaz-205 and Almaz-206 space station hulls with the intention of completing and launching them. The 2 modules are transported to the Isle of Man in the United Kingdom in 2011. The company also purchased 4 VA return capsule hulls, with 1 planned to be used for space tourism, with the other 3 being used for scientific and commercial payloads. Although the company planned to start flights by 2012, later plans for lunar flights delayed the first launch until 2015. However, all those plans failed to come to fruition. Financial and legal problems led to the company ceasing operation in 2016, with no flights having taken place. Thanks for watching, And if you like this video, please like and subscribe, and check out the other videos on this channel. And remember, when the future was cool,